Welcome. My name is Steve Winnick, and I am both the writer and editor at the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress and the co-convener of the Music and Song section of the American Folklore Society. And this is a presentation that we're going to be making at the American Folklore Society annual meeting, which was going to be in Tulsa, Oklahoma, but is now a virtual meeting. And I'm here with Dom Flemons. Dom is a Grammy-winning recording artist with the Carolina Chocolate Drops and now records solo and performs solo as the American Songster. So welcome, Dom.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be with you.
All right, we're going to talk to you about your life and your work today. So why don't you just give us a little recap of your early years and how you got into music in the first place?
Oh, sure thing. Well, when I started out, I always liked to sing. And my first experience playing a musical instrument came when I was in 5th grade. I started playing percussion in school, and I took that all the way through high school, starting out with, I guess, the suspended cymbal, the timpanis, and things like that in concert band. And then later on, I played the marching bass drum, and I played on a 4 bass drum line in all of my 4 years of high school. And around junior in high school, I saw the documentary, The History of Rock and Roll. And it was the Quincy Jones produced documentary. It was just on TV.
Right.
And that introduced me to early rock and roll, as well as Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf's music. And there was also an episode on the folk revival called Pluggin' In, and it was talking about the early, I guess, the Northeast folk revival in New York and also in Boston, and how it translated over to San Francisco and became a part of the electric psychedelic rock and roll movement. And so I was drawn to that. I was drawn to Dylan and Hendrix and the Beatles and stuff like that. I was, I don't know, 15 or 16. So like any kid that age, you get susceptible to rock and roll. But what happened to me afterward is I got into Dylan. It got me also into the Newport Folk Festival. So I started to scavenge for LPs. And this was before there was a resurgence in vinyl. So I was able to find hundreds and hundreds of records associated with folk music. And I had no guide or guru to lead me for the most part, so I just was trying to figure out what all these artists did, what their music meant, and learned a couple of songs along the way. So that's what I did up until 2005. I played music and busked while I went to college, got a degree in English, and then halfway in between I got into slam poetry, so I put my guitar down for a while and got deep into performance poetry, spoken word from what was contemporary at that time was people like Danny Solis or Mark Smith, who were pioneers of slam. But also I was getting into Allen Ginsberg and Lawrence Ferlinghetti and Jack Kerouac and Amiri Baraka. So I was reading these books at the same time, along with my Chaucer and Shakespeare. So that around 2003. I got deep into old-timey music and the music on 78s of the 20s and 30s, and I got deep into Yazoo records. So at first I was into like 60s folk revival, then I got into 20s and 30s music. So I had two different perspectives in which I heard people like John Hurt or Skip James. I heard their later records first, then I heard their earlier records later, and that was when I went to the Black Banjo Gathering and started my professional career.
Great. So all of that previous to your professional career was mostly in Arizona, right?
Yeah, it was all in Arizona. When I was in the Poetry Slam, I went to 2 national slams. So I went to Minneapolis and Chicago 1 year at a time, but that was mostly what I did. I stayed all around Arizona, and just there were folk festivals in Phoenix, Flagstaff, and Prescott over at Charlotte Hall, which again would later would be important later for the Black Cowboys story, because when I was out there doing the Prescott Folk Festival, I didn't realize that Charlotte Hall and Gail Gardner and all those people were the legendary cowboy poets of that area. But I was very familiar with the area, having grown up there, so I knew what the Sierra Pietres, the Sire Peaks. I knew what that was, because I knew what the mountain range was, and I knew the folklore around the cowboy song. So later on, I used that as it was sort of like a reminiscing back to my early days, even though I never sang cowboy songs. But there were all these local festivals, and there were a lot of musicians. Some were professionals and some weren't, and later on I would meet them in my travels, like people like Rick Nestler and Rick Polari. I met them when I was 16, and Rick Nestler, Ricco, and his wife Donna, they were some of the first people that I led the jug band jam with in Phoenix, as well as Rick Polari was the first guy who interviewed me actually the very first year that I was at the Phoenix Folk Festival, and he told me that the interview was going to go into the Library of Congress. He told me that, and that excited me because up to that point I'd only seen Woody Guthrie, the Library of Congress recordings. So the Library of Congress was this faraway place that I dreamed about, that I would have an interview in. And of course later on in my journeys I would then meet people like yourselves and all these wonderful folklorists in addition to musicians and whatnot, and I got to relive some of the dreams and about the places I had heard about in books.
That's great. So while you were busking and stuff in college and you know, your time in Arizona, what was the music you were playing? I mean, you got into the 60s stuff and then the 20s stuff. Was that primarily what you played as well?
Yeah, for the most part, I wrote a lot of songs at that time. Between my songs, I would play a lot of songs from like Bob Dylan and Phil Ochs. For a while, I was playing Cat Stevens and Leonard Cohen. I was playing a lot of Muddy Waters, Lightning Hopkins, a lot of Howlin' Wolf, Jimmy Reed. Who else was there? Brownie McGee and Sonny Terry.
Sure.
Mississippi John Hurt, because at that time also, since this was before you could research things on the internet wholesale, I came across Stephen Grossman's Guitar Workshop, and so I was able to find tablature so I could, you know, at first I was just playing by ear, but through the public library system I was able to find a ton of books that were again from the 50s, 60s,
Right.
and 70s, and anything beyond that I had to learn by ear. So I also kind of collided with a full-on movement of acoustic music and popular music too. So I wasn't necessarily playing a lot of Jack Johnson or any of that stuff, but it was out there in the ether. Tenacious D, who's a comedy group,
Yeah.
even though they're a novelty group, they were one of the groups that really emphasized acoustic guitars in the front. Tom Waits was doing a lot of stuff, Johnny Cash, that type of thing. So. And then Old Crow Medicine Show, when they did their first major label album, that really inspired me because it was kind of like, it was old-timey music, but it was much faster and it had an edge like rock and roll or punk rock. And so that was something that I was drawn to, being someone interested in the style of blues that was represented by people like Lightning Hopkins or Mance Lipscomb, it was a little bit more up-tempo. It was a little bit more forward-leaning on the beat than, say, B.B. King or more popular types of blues that I could hear on the
Sure.
radio or on television, for example. So it was sort of a distinctive breaking away from the blues I had been taught from the television when I started to find Yazoo records or some of the early records of Vanguard or
Right.
things like that, you know.
And you picked up the banjo during that period, and
Yeah.
so what style were you playing in initially?
Well, in 2003, I had an old girlfriend of mine who wanted a guitar, and so I took her to the music store, and I ended up with the banjo at the end. And what happened was a friend of mine a year previous, this is in 2002, a friend of mine had gone out to busk in Europe, and he'd left his 5-string banjo with me. And he had taken the 5th string out of the banjo because he really couldn't figure out how clawhammer worked. So he just took the 5th string out of it and gave me a banjo with 4 long strings on it. So I learned all the guitar songs I knew on the banjo because I didn't really know that there was a style of banjo that needed to be played. So I realized that the notes were similar to the high 4 strings of the guitar. So that's what I did at first. I just translated songs that were punchier songs that needed a more of a propulsive rhythm onto the banjo. So I did that for a while. And for a while I had a homemade 6-string banjo that I bought from a store because I saw one, and like anybody else that's played the 6-string banjo, I thought, wow, a combination of banjo and guitar in a single instrument, great. And then I played it and I realized it was neither instrument but a new mutation of both instruments combined. So I played that for a long time too. Yeah, and when I got my first banjo on my own, when I went to that music store, it was a Ludwig Dixieland 4-string banjo. And so I started to try to find music that represented this style of jazz banjo. And so
Yeah.
I came across an album called Sweet Emma and Her Preservation Hall Jazz Band. And that led me on a whole trajectory of going into Dixieland or New Orleans jazz, both as the 50s and 60s and 40s version, but then later through Folkways recordings I found a copy of New Orleans, the 1920s, the great reissue from Sam Charters on RBF
Right.
Records. I found that in my college library. So that got me into 20s and 30s music. But it was different than Louis Armstrong or the Hot Five. I got into Papa Celestin and the original Tuxedo Jazz
Right.
Band and Sam Morgan's jazz band, which is kind of more obscure New Orleans jazz band. But at the time, I was just collecting. At the same time, I found the Prestige Living Legends series, so I was a big fan of that. So that was how I spent a lot of time playing banjo, was trying to play like Manny Sales or Narvin Kimball or those banjo players.
Interesting.
And then at the Black Banjo Gathering in 2005, I met Don Vappy, and of course that was a new level of banjo excellency that I had to
Right.
try to reach to, because Don
Yeah.
Vappy's such a phenomenal player that my style that was Dixieland with a combination of Doc Boggs and Clarence Ashley, as I figured it out, not knowing I needed 5 strings, I figured out a way to frail without having the 5th string on
Right.
the top. So I had a style I had developed. I also learned slide banjo, having read about Gus Cannon, so I developed a way to play bottleneck style banjo. And it was just sort of a combination of all those things at one time. And so when I went to the gathering, I was a little bit embarrassed because I didn't have a real style. Everybody else had like a North Carolina style or a Kentucky style or
Right.
this style. And then, when I met Joe Thompson, he was being backed up by Bob Carlin, who has a little bit of every style as well. And when I started to play, everybody was so excited that I had a style that was not the standard style that they encouraged me to keep going. And they actually had a silent auction at the Black Banjo Gathering in 2005 for a good time banjo. And the silent auction, I ended up winning it. They thought I should have it. So at the end of the gathering, having learned a lot about African and Caribbean and African American banjo traditions in sort of a broad way through a academic event, I was then given a banjo and encouraged to keep going. So for me, it was like every step of the way, Stephen, every time I felt like I was just reaching in the dark with some music, I had a confirmation that responded, or a reverberation
Right.
that came back to me that said, you're on the right path. And, like anything else, it's like being Doctor Who in its own type of way.
Yeah.
The character where you reach out into one sort of universe, and sometimes history can bring back some amazing things. And so that's kind of where that's how my banjo playing started.
Sounds good. Well,
yeah.
back up a bit and explain the Black Banjo Gathering, because
Oh,
you've mentioned
sure.
it a couple of times, but I think not everyone who's watching this will know what that was.
Absolutely. Well, Cece Conway, Dr. Cecilia Conway, I should use her formal name, Dr. Cecilia Conway from Appalachian State University, she wrote a book, African Banjo Echoes in Appalachia, and she also put together the wonderful Black Banjo Songsters of North Carolina and Virginia for the Smithsonian Folkways. So leading up to 2005, she had wanted to have an event that focused on black banjo as an idea or a concept, because of course the banjo is mostly associated with white Appalachian culture, even though if you do any forensic research before the 20th century, you find a lot of information on African American, Caribbean, and African banjo in a lot of different forms. So it's not just one type of banjo, it's not just one type of person or one demographic. It just kind of goes into this very, just very in-depth history that reaches through every aspect of American history. So CC wanted to put an event that would just try to do something to bring all of these different communities together. African American banjo players, banjo scholars that were old-time, bluegrass, gourd banjo scholars, which is another style, minstrel stroke style banjo scholars, as well as historians of the minstrel show in a general sense. Trying to bring all these communities together, it was quite a task. And I was just brought into the gathering as just a young banjo player who was interested. I was brought in by a fellow named Sule Greg Wilson, who was an African drummer from Washington, D.C. He studied with Ola Tunji and the Copacetics, and so he has like this background of both tap dance as well as African drumming. So his conduit into the banjo was through African drumming, where his mentors finally told him, "You've done everything you can about African drumming. Now you must find the American story." And so his American story was the banjo. So back in Phoenix, let's say February of 2005, Sule comes to my local folk round robin, the open mic night, and he heard that I had played the banjo. Someone had tipped him off to it, and so he invited me to come to the gathering. And so I saved up all of my money and took a trip out to Charlotte, North Carolina, and I got a ride from Tony Thomas, the founder of Black Banjo Players Then and Now. And I got to get all of the perspectives of all the different organizers of what they thought about black banjo. So I got to hear everybody's perspective as the event was happening. Through the course of this event, you had people like Don Vappy, who I mentioned before, who was a Preservation Hall banjo player. You had Sheikh Amala Jabate from Mali there, Daniel Jata from the Gambia. Sheikh was talking about his instrument, the ngone. Daniel was talking about his instrument, the akonting. Ulf Jagfors, the wonderful scholar, was with Daniel Jata and giving context for the akonting, which was still sort of a new piece of scholarship, even in West African folk instrument scholarship. So it was sort of a new trend. Also, Aljamae Hinton was there, and I'd known about her from hearing the Music Maker album, Honey Babe, years back. And so that was great to see a blues singer of her caliber in person. And she played banjo as well, Get My Baby Out of Jail, which is a beautiful version of Rubens Train. So to see that live was something. Then I met Rhiannon Giddens. I didn't meet Justin Robinson there. Rhiannon was organizing as well, and the two of us started to jam, and we started to chat about music. And then Joe Thompson was there as well. And up to that point, I had really gotten obsessed with the music of Henry Ragtime Texas Thomas, and I was trying to figure out how to replicate that style of guitar and quills playing. And I couldn't find quills, and there wasn't really a manual for how to find quills, especially with the Henry Thomas 78s itself. So one of the other people that was there was Mike Seeger, and that was one of the people I went to go see at the gathering as well, so I could figure out how to play quills. So when I had a chance to talk to Mike, I asked him about the quills, and I asked him about music and sort of his life story, and he told me to come out to Lexington, Virginia and visit him sometime. And that was between Mike and Joe Thompson, and then meeting Rhiannon and you know, everybody else. And then to throw it in there, Bela Fleck was around, and I met him for the very first time because he had just come back from Africa on what would become Throw Down Your Heart, his wonderful documentary. But at that time, he was only coming back saying, I just went to Africa and I had this amazing experience. And then he had a great big jam with Sheikh Amala Jabate in the lobby. So again, having not been introduced to African music before in the live performance setting, the idea of banjo, Africanisms, and Caribbeanism, all of those ideas formed into one during that gathering for me. And then Joe, being obsessed with Henry Thomas, when I began to hear Joe playing Steel Driving Man, his version of John Henry, his version is so reminiscent to Henry Thomas's version, it gave me a revelation in my mind that would eventually become the American Songster.
And how old was Joe at that time approximately?
He was 85 years old at that time, and Bob Carlin was backing him up at that time because his cousin Odell had passed. And at that point, I got to sit with Joe a little bit, but it wasn't until after...
And he was an African-American banjo player.
Yeah, with Joe Thompson, one of the things that was great with Joe Thompson, that Joe, he was an African-American fiddler from Mebane, North Carolina, and in the old-time community, he'd become well-known as one of the last arbiters of traditional African-American music, as learned at home from family members leading into the present. And so in general, they wanted everyone that was African-American to spend some time with Joe, just in general, to spend some time with him and sit at the feet of the elders. So I did that in general. But then as I was just so inspired by the gathering, and I was just about to finish college. I graduated in May of '05. The gathering was in April of '05. So 2 weeks after I get back from the gathering, I finished college, and then I just sold everything I owned, and I jumped on I-40. I rode Route 66 all the way down to North Carolina, searching for the music.
Right.
I wanted to see what Joe Thompson's music was about. I wanted to see what Mike Seeger's offer to have him come to his house was about, and learn the quills and learn whatever else, you know. At that time, I didn't even know the bones, but I didn't know that I would instantly be brought face to face with my own knowledge of percussion right when I went to North Carolina. But it was a bunch of things like that, Stephen, where I put a lot of ideas out there when I went, but the reverberations that came back gave me something much greater than I ever would have anticipated.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about meeting Joe and meeting Rhiannon right there,
Yeah.
that is life-changing.
Absolutely.
So explain, I guess the next step would be, first of all, this beginning of exploring North Carolina music, but then the Carolina Chocolate Drop. So explain how that came together.
Well, at the gathering, Sule, Rhiannon, and I hit it off, and we started to jam as a trio. And we found that was a really powerful sound. And during the summer of 2005, right before I moved, Rhiannon came out, and we started a group called Sankofa Strings, which was based on the idea of course, the proverb of Sankofa, because we felt like that was what we were doing from the gathering, was we were doing the ultimate manifestation of Sankofa in string band music. And through this, at least for me, on how I decided to approach it, Sankofa doesn't need to be a term that is militant or direct. It's more of a term that you collect a bunch of information and you bring it forward. And I always felt like that was something that was needed with the banjo's history. There was so much bad history wrapped around the banjo that to me it was almost, you didn't have to pander nor lessen or soften the message, but just having a square dance and seeing African American people involved was an innovation and was a revelation for people to see. So we were, of course, drawn in by the gathering, but then once we started to perform, of course, in Sankofa Strings, we played at the Flagstaff Folk Festival as our first gig. We got this huge standing ovation for a 20-minute set from the entire crowd. And I had been gigging for 5-6 years, so I'd known what playing a 20-minute gig was like, and it's not always a standing ovation, and not an enthusiastic one. It wasn't just a regular one. It was a jump out of your seat standing ovation. And with that group, so Sankofa Strings, and then when I moved out to North Carolina, Rhiannon and Justin had started to visit Joe Thompson, so they started to learn a way to play Joe's music with the two of them. So they had a trio started, maybe 2 or 3 months of doing that. And so Rhiannon, I think, had invited me to come out, and I just drove right out, and then I started going down with them. And so the four of us started playing with Joe every Wednesday night. And we did that for about 2.5 years altogether, of just every Wednesday just going to Joe's and just hearing the stories, learning the history, as well as learning the music and figuring out a way to play with Joe. Because of course Joe played in the old style where he just picked up the fiddle and started going.
Right.
And I mean, if you didn't know the song, there was no instructions for how the song was supposed to go. So so for fiddle and banjo, it's kind of easy because in a string band, you just kind of do unison or you do slight counterpoint in a string band. But for a guitar, a lot of Joe's songs were one chord, so I found I was banging a G chord the whole time, and I was, I started to think to myself, how can I create an exciting part for me to play? And that allowed me to go back into my mind and think about stories of Leadbelly talking about playing in a string band with his uncles, or Charlie Patton playing with the Mississippi Sheiks. And I started to think along those lines, like, what type of things would Leadbelly or Charlie Patton have played in this string band setting if placed there? And so that's where a lot of my arrangement ideas came from, was taking things I'd read about, either stories or reminiscences, or just slight musical fragments. It was almost musical archaeology in a way. Dusting back an ancient Roman fresco of music and saying, what was this?
Right.
And then trying to reconstruct it. And so that was something I thought was important to do in general, just because there weren't a lot of younger people doing just traditional with no original material. And I kept the group very strict on that for 9 years. We had 1 or 2 original songs that made it out, but for the most part, everybody loved the fact that we played Don't Get Trouble in Your Mind, Georgia Buck, Old Corn Liquor, and all these old time songs were the ones that were the real draw every single time. And it was because we were a young African American string band doing it. There was a visual that inspired and drew people in beside just the music. But of course, I played to and against that. I played to the idea that people wanted the novelty of a black string band. That was one thing. But I also played against that by being the arbiter and the A&R man and the folklorist that did the forensics, so that whenever I said anything to an interviewer, it was more or less all facts, But I also got to spin a little yarn to get people to thinking, you know, because when you start hearing stories like Muddy Waters playing with Son Sims,
Yeah.
and Son Sims, the only other time that Son Sims records outside the Library of Congress is with Charlie Patton in the 1920s. I mean, there's a timeline I wanna explore and discover. And so a lot of the arrangement ideas with the Chocolate Drops, and then going into the solo career after the Chocolate Drops, so they were built on those ideas.
That's great. So, you know, one thing that I've heard both you and Rhiannon talk about at various times is the fact that, you know, the banjo in particular, and then also string band music in general, was something that the African American community kind of moved on from in a way at a certain point, that most African American folks decided they didn't want to be associated with that sort of rural country phase of life anymore and moved on to other things. And so it became kind of a novelty, even though it was central to African American life at one time. But it also led to a certain extent, you guys swimming against the stream with certain people. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, yeah. Well, sure. You know, one of the funny things is that the advent of strict segregation in the early 20th century is very paramount to this story. Because the string band music, its roots fall in the mid 19th century and at times before, you know, give or take on a couple of different things. And the main translation point for a lot of early African American music came through the minstrel show. And so in some ways, the minstrel show, as I've traveled more, the minstrel show is all built on these horrible racial stereotypes, but the theatrical form of minstrelsy is based on ideas like German folk opera, as well as British music hall, in which you have thespians playing characters that are not them themselves,
Right.
but they're characters that they're performing on stage. And so the minstrel show is built on this idea. The problem that comes with the minstrel show, of course, is when the audience begins to think that the people they're seeing on stage are the same as the people they see outside of the stage, which is where you've had constant troubles. And by the 1880s and 1890s, you have a new form of minstrelsy come through, which is called the coon song. And the coon song's musical accompaniment is ragtime. And so ragtime is built off of a style of popular song that is even more offensive,
Right.
but it's also written by both African American and white songwriters, cashing in on the offensiveness. So even to this day, this music of the 1890s would give us the impression that every single person was extremely racist in the 1890s, which I think there is a gauge in which to look at it. Because when you know in the 1890s, this is the era of yellow journalism. This is the era in which they created media that was meant to send people on a emotional journey to go down, manipulate them one way or the other. The songs also reflect this. So leading into the 20th century, we have strict segregation where black and white are the two ethnic, designations. And they built the recording industry 2 decades after the, implementation of strict segregation. So the categorization is built off of this idea that white music is country or
Right.
hillbilly or old familiar or Appalachian or any number of terms, and black music is race music, R&B, rhythm and blues, the longer term for it, spirituals, gospel, jazz. And even to this day, the computers can't justify if you put black country or white blues into if you put it into the data, it doesn't compute, because we've created such categorizations for the music that country will always seem white, and if you have a black country singer, it's automatically an oxymoron. Just like a white blues singer and even a white rapper, same thing. When
Right.
a white rapper gains some prominence, it's an oxymoron in people's minds. They say, wait a second, he shouldn't know the cultural parts that are synonymous with black culture through rap as a white person. But the same thing happens when you have a Charlie Pride person who or that type of country singer where Charlie Pride's an African American, but he sounds like a standard country and western singer. What do you do with that when he goes on stage? So with the Carolina Chocolate Drops, we had to address that in many different forms. There was first addressing it with history, like the story of Leslie Riddle and his connection with the Carter family, where instead of it being a story of straight misappropriation, Leslie Riddle's story, as I began to hear from Mike Seeger, and then later when I listened to Leslie Riddle's interviews that Mike Seeger personally did with him, it dawned on me that Leslie Riddle never saw money or a profession in music, but he spent time with the Carter family collecting the music because they were friends, they were confidants, they were neighbors for a certain period of time. And through that period of time, the Carter family incorporated aspects of Leslie's music, whether it was the most famous part, which is a song like the Cannonball, which Leslie played, and then Maybelle recorded in her particular Carter scratch, for the Carter family as Cannonball Blues. Now, when you listen to these two performers, because on paper it would say, oh, well, Maybelle grabbed everything from Leslie and made her style from Leslie's music. But when you listen to the two people together, Leslie's music is firmly rooted in North Carolina Piedmont blues guitar tradition. And it doesn't sound like Maybelle necessarily.
Right.
And Maybelle at the same time doesn't really sound like Leslie when you listen to them. But you can hear the elements that they swapped to make that music. So that was one revelation. And the other half of it is it then made me think of the Carter family in a whole different way. When I think about a song like Will the Circle Be Unbroken or Can the Circle Be Unbroken, even if it is performed by a white performer, if it's rooted in the black church, it is still a black song. And to know that the Carter family were one of the first artists to record songs like that, or When the World's on Fire, Pentecostal black church music in a recorded setting, that says a little bit more about the social tolerance that the Carter family specifically might have had. But again, that's what I always leaned in and out of when we were doing the Carolina Chocolate Drops, is how far can we push this idea of African Americans are part of string band music, and what ways can we find that we're connected together instead of apart, which is, of course, has always been the other half of the conversation, which is naturally people would say, because of segregation and racism, blacks aren't allowed to be in country music. But what happens when you get into the 21st century, when we've socially said that they should be? Everybody should be able to do any type of music they want. How do you put that to the test? And that's what we did with the Chocolate Drops. And not just with being African American country and Western artists coming in that way, but we came in as an old-time string band. Then we were able to get into the Grand Ole Opry as our very first gigs in Nashville. We didn't have to do Music Row. Why? We weren't writing anything. We were representing old-time music, which was a strong piece of this prehistory. And places like the Grand Ole Opry picked up on it right off the bat, because of course they've been trying to figure out ways to honor D. Ford Bailey, because they know that in the past they didn't, but now in the 21st century, our group was an opportunity to be able to bring some of that musical performance and excitement into the current era. And so that was something we were able to do. I always tell people in the Chocolate Drops we were making history every day at one point, for about 6 or 7 of the years. Just every single event happened to be something that was, we named ourselves the Carolina Chocolate Drops after I watched the movie Louie Bluey. And it was literally that scene of the Cackling Hen where the Tennessee Ramblers are sitting with Louie Bluey, and he's playing that beautiful fiddle on there and just letting that bow jump all around on the fiddle. That really inspired me at first. And then when I moved out to North Carolina, I brought the VHS with me, because of course it wasn't on DVD, and I showed it to Rhiannon and Justin, and that was when we decided we should call ourselves the Carolina Chocolate Drops. And so just that alone also created its own groundswell, because Louie Bluey, he was not able to get the recognition that he desired in his lifetime, and he's gotten a legendary status since then. And so we were also trying our best to fulfill that void. And there was a void that was there from the representation of African Americans within folk music, string band, also in blues. Solo blues, country blues artists were still sort of a rarity. There was like Guy Davis and Taj and Eric Bibb and everything, but a collective group of African Americans doing blues and string band and jug band, that was something that we presented something very different. And of course I tried to do a sepia-toned version of the Beatles, the Kingston Trio, the New Lost City Ramblers, and Colonel Rand Glover when it came to packaging. That's why everybody's known as an individual as well as a collective. And then we had Exuberance which is what I liked about the Kingston Trio. I just liked that they just
Yeah,
banged
yeah.
away on instruments, and that was exciting.
Yeah.
So when we did a lot of our string band, I would a lot of the breakdowns. I incorporated a real exuberant guitar style to bring excitement in that same way. But we tried to be like the Ramblers because we wanted to show people that we were educated African Americans too, because
Right.
that was important. Because the old system has always been someone from a rural community, a professor. They make a partnership and they present the materials with their partnership. And for us, we were a group that we didn't need to have a professor presenting us, but we could also work in line with a university as well. So it was also, first time we performed in Big Stone Gap, Virginia, they did a big celebration of Carl Martin with our concert.
Right.
Because, up to that point, there really hadn't been an occasion in which to celebrate Carl Martin wholesale in Big Stone Gap till we got there. But we were able to receive all those things. And then I've been able to continue to do that afterward with the Chocolate Drops, too. Just in whatever various form.
Yeah. So you mentioned a few people who might have served as mentors. I don't know whether you worked with them. People like Taj. Did you ever work with Taj Mahal?
Well, Taj Mahal, it's funny enough with him, I got to meet Taj Mahal through Timothy Duffy with Music Maker Relief Foundation. So after I moved to North Carolina, we started doing some gigs up until, I'm going to say right in the beginning of 2006 was when we started touring as the Carolina Chocolate Drops. Of course, we did mostly educational programs in North Carolina at that point. But in the spring of 2006, I met Tim Duffy over at the Shikori Hills Festival in Silk Hope, North Carolina. And at that time, he had just started working with Adolphus Bell, the one-man band, and I was into that album. So, like I mentioned before, I had listened to Music Maker albums in Phoenix. So I was familiar that he knew Taj, from Taj being a creative consultant, but also Aljamain Hinton's work, as well as John D. Holman. I was really interested in the type of blues singers Tim had been presenting in Music Maker. So when I got a chance to finally meet him in person, I just sort of pulled him to the side and said, "Hey, man, are you the guy that works with John D. and Aljamain?" And Tim was more excited than I was to meet him because he was like, "You know who I am?" Which was, again, a not uncommon thing that happened.
Right.
Many folklorists and scholars and folk musicians, they put it out there. And it may take 20, 30 years before anyone even says, "I love that album," you
Right.
know? And Tim was just so blown away that I was a young black guy that liked this music that for years he just did it, And
Yeah.
so when we got to talking, I told him the Chocolate Drops wanted to work with him. We had just cut our first demo, which was would be the album Dona Got a Ramblin' Mind.
Right.
And Tim just took our demo, we sequenced it, and put it together as the first Music Maker record. And from there, it was sort of a weird thing. Like Sule, with our Sankofa Strings record, had approached Taj at a gig in Tempe, Arizona, where Sule was living, and passed Taj a package with Sankofa Strings. At the same time, Tim had passed Taj the Carolina Chocolate Drop. So Taj got both of these records at one time, two
Interesting.
sister records at the same time from two different sources. And on Sankofa Strings' Colored Aristocracy, I do a version of Johnny Too Bad with Sule that is based off of Taj's version, and we do a banjo and ukulele version, trying to kind of get the Slickers version, but we sing it like Taj. So Taj was so blown away to hear us doing his version of Johnny Too Bad to start, and then he heard the Chocolate Drops, and he said, "Oh man, I got to know these guys." So I'm. This is still when I was living in. I was still sleeping on Rhiannon's floor at that time in 2006. But Tim calls me up and says, "Hey, Taj loves your album. He wants you to call him. Here's his cell phone number. Call Taj now." And I'm like, "Oh dang, I'm calling Taj now."
I guess I got to do that.
And I just sat there for 20 minutes saying, "Man, do I call him Mr. Mahal or just Taj?" And so I finally call him. And Taj lays this huge 20-minute compliment on the group, what we represent, what it means, and he said he'd get behind us and do anything he could for us, which was a great introduction to someone who, again, I loved his work from the beginning. I've always been a big fan of his work, like Recycling the Blues and other stuff with Cakewalk into Town.
Absolutely.
And the beautiful solo set. I mean, once I started getting deeper into the folk revival, of course, Taj was part of a slightly younger generation, so when I got into the 60s stuff, all of a sudden the Live at the Fillmore East with Taj guesting on it was a staple. So I knew Taj's stuff very well. Even when I did, I always tell people this and they get a kick out of it. When I did Hit 'Em Up Style, the banjo part I do for that song on with the Chocolate Drops, that was partially formed because of Taj's version of Leaving Trunk, where he did bo no 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 no. Ba-na-na. So I did ba da da ga da ga da da ba da 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 ba da 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 da. So it was kind of a Taj-y sort of move, and so to get him on the phone and then he just lays this huge compliment on us, it just knocked us out. And he gave a quote on the very first Chocolate Drops record saying this group is electrifying, which gave us a lot of cachet that I think it would have been much harder for us to have moved forward if we hadn't linked up with Music Maker. But at the same time, I was able to break away from the Chocolate Drop for years with Music Maker, and I've been a board member since 2009. I've worked with them, and through that I worked with John D. Holman and Boo Hanks and Captain Luke and any number of wonderful traditional blues players that I kind of filled the role that Taj filled in the early 90s for Music Maker, where I was the de facto session man. So I was there for all the sessions. I got to know everybody. I gave people rides. I just did a lot of sort of the background work while learning my craft through knowing all these beautiful Southern traditional artists. And I think I got fast-tracked in a certain way because while I'm off tour, I'm going to Music Maker. And again, we did tintypes, we did sessions, we did just the gigs, the benefits, the fundraisers. And again, I learned how to ride a 15-passenger, taking 10 old bluesmen around, taking them 300 miles down the road to take them to Newport and back, that type of thing.
Yeah, and that's really Music Maker provides that service. So I mean, explain them a little bit, because I think people might not know about them also.
Yeah, Music Maker Relief Foundation is a nonprofit organization that helps traditional Southern blues artists. And how it started was Tim, he did his dissertation on lute in Mombasa, Africa, and he saw that there was a power in respecting your elders, and when you give the elders the power, they can give the power to the community. And so he applied that to the southern traditional, mostly blues, but there are also Appalachian artists on Music Maker as well, but a lot of it is blues. And it just goes at the idea that in certain parts of the rural South, you've got people that have such a poverty level that is like unimaginable to our. It's almost like third world countries sometimes in some of the cases of the artists. And Music Maker just does what it can to, on a case by case scenario, get a little money into people's hands, or if it's not money they're needing, because a lot of times what happens is that when the money runs low with a lot of these musicians, they have to pawn their instruments.
Right.
So that they can get food. But if you start getting to a spot where you need to go between food and medicine, then the guitar never comes back because you're choosing between these two things.
Right.
And Music Maker is meant to help with just small sustenance programs. And they get to know the artist, and because Tim, he went to folklore school and realized that a lot of times there isn't an opportunity to have a full, long-lasting relationship with an artist. And Music Maker was built on the idea of helping the artist out with a hand up and not a hand out. And so that's kind of been the whole structure around Music Maker. And Tim and his wife Denise have done an amazing job with that. Like Boo Hanks, for example, when I met him, he was still in this really old dilapidated trailer he had had since the mid-50s. And in the course of working with Music Maker and getting to present Boo's music, we were able to get donors to get together so that they could get Boo a new trailer. And getting a new trailer sometimes means going through the clauses of zoning and all these other things that happen in the South, where Music Maker is also there to make sure that the new trailer happens, it's there, it's set up in place, and then artists gets to enjoy it. Because sometimes that happens too. You set up a new place and then situations happen.
Yeah.
And Music Maker is also there to help just in whatever way they can. It's not the biggest organization, but it's always meant to help people. And so I was drawn to their message back in Arizona. And then when I got to meet Tim, I said, "Of course I'm going to join on to your cause, Tim." And oh, sorry, hold on. Let me just go ahead and take that out.
Yeah.
I was glad to join Tim's cause once I had a chance to meet him, and then once I got to meet the guys. The very first time I went down to Music Maker to their office, I told Tim that I really liked John D. Holman's work, and he picked up the phone. He said, "Hey, John D., there's a young black guy that wants to meet you. Come on down." 20 minutes later, on the gravel road that Tim was living on at that time, old pickup truck shows up, and John D. Holman. And at that time, I hadn't met a lot of my idols in recording.
Yeah.
So as an audience member, there's a certain, distance you have. You're like, oh, this artist is untouchable, unattainable. And especially when you grow up with rock music, they're also unattainable too. But in folk music, I began to learn that artists are easier to access, And so John D. comes up, and he just starts saying hello to me and lays a bit of jive on me because he's a really great talker. And then he shook my hand, and he held my hand for 10 minutes as he shook my hand, and just began to ask me about where I came from and why I was here and why I wanted to learn the blues. And it just moved him that I had taken so much time to go 2,500 miles to come to North Carolina. So I got a lot of assurance and reinforcement from both scholars as well as traditional players as well. So it was a really great give and take, So I did my work with Music Maker while touring, and then also keeping up with my normal forensics.
Right. And so, I mean, one of the life-changing things that happened with the Carolina Chocolate Drops was the Grammy Award. So talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely. Well, we built such momentum with the Carolina Chocolate Drops. It was pretty astounding. I mean, it all happened very fast.
Yeah.
We were a full-time band in 2007, and again, the gathering happened in April of 2005. So in less than a year and a half, we had made our way to the Folk Alliance International Conference in Memphis, and that created another groundswell, because every single time we were out there, as I mentioned before, the representation of African American music in the traditional music context outside of blues and gospel alone was scarce enough that it was a really big groundswell when anybody heard that we were coming into town. And that first Folk Alliance allowed us to go to Europe for the first time. We got festivals in Canada, the UK, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, and then with Canada it was Winnipeg, Edmonton, and Ottawa.
Mm-hmm.
So we did all of that in like 1 year in 2008. So we hit all those things up. I met Scott Beretta, the wonderful blues writer, over at Folk Alliance, and through him I got to meet G. Mark Roswell when Denzel Washington did The Great Debaters in 2007. And so that was another thing that happened. So I met Scott, and Scott wanted us to work with Alvin Youngblood Hart in some type of way. And I've always loved Alvin Youngblood Hart as a great blues singer. And so it just so happened G. Mark Roswell calls him for The Great Debaters. And Scott made this amazing deal somehow over here so that he calls me and says, "Hey, Dom, do you want to be in a Denzel Washington movie?" I said, "Yes." And so we went right out to Shreveport, Louisiana. And this was in the middle of touring. So just to give you a sense of how we used to do in the Chocolate Drops, that was the same week we played at the Stagville Plantation in Durham. So we did a 100-person show at the Stagville Plantation. We then had to drive to Raleigh to RDU, jump on a plane, go to St. Louis so that we could be on the Prairie Home Companion show.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the first time we had done that with Garrison Keillor. And after we did that, we flew back over to North Carolina. And then we went and we did Merle Fest then. Mm-hmm. So then we flew back, did Merle Fest, then got back to RDU and flew to Shreveport to then do The Great Debaters, which was over right across the border into Texas from Shreveport. Mm-hmm. So it was like a 3-hour drive. So we went and did that, and then drove back, went back, and then we went on to tour for another 2.5 months after doing that. But that was how that's how it was. But I was glad that I had read a lot about music and traveling beforehand, because it would have swallowed me up whole if I hadn't have, as my own personal hobby, spent so much time thinking about how much musicians travel.
Yeah.
Because then when I was in the thick of it, I was like, great, we're hitting it like the Beatles. We're going to tour as much as we possibly can until it's done.
Yeah.
And that's what we did. We did 9 hard years of traveling, but they were good years. And like I said, we made history most every day.
Yeah.
And it was tough when the group finally started to wind down. It was
How did you realize that was happening? I mean,
I noticed that we covered all of the goals we ever set out to do too many times. That ended up being what happened, which is a rare thing for a band, where you covered all the goals so much that everybody had to break apart. And that's what we ended up doing. It was like, I remember we first sat down with the Yellow Pad and said, we're going to do Merle Fest, we're going to do the Grand Ole Opry, we're going to do this, that, and the other. I mean, we might even had going to Bristol, Tennessee, because that was even before the Birthplace of Country Music Museum existed. But we were like, we'll go to Bristol, and we just had a list of stuff, but we covered that 4 times in a row. We did everything we ever set out to do, then got the Grammy.
Yeah.
And it was always interesting.
Yeah, that wasn't even on the list.
That
right?
wasn't
You
even
didn't
on the
think,
list, you know, because that was, again, the momentum grew in such a way that each time we presented the group, it created a groundswell that was bigger exponentially than what came before.
Yeah.
And so when we did the Nonesuch deal to do Genuine Negro Jig, we had built so much momentum all the way up with Music Maker that I knew that we had a home run if we just did all of the songs that people liked from our stage show.
Yeah.
And that's basically what we did. We added a couple of extra ones, like Justin at the last minute decided he wanted to write a song, so he wrote one, Kissin' and Cussin', which more or less took my favorite song, James Alley Blues, and turned it into its own original song.
Yeah.
But he kind of wanted to really write that song. We did Why Don't You Do Right, because that was one Sule had around, and Sule guested on it, and that was kind of our last hurrah with Sule. So it was really also a manifestation of Sankofa Strings and Carolina Chocolate Drops, even though it says Carolina Chocolate Drops on the title. It was all 4 of the members. Yeah, we did that. I'm trying to think of what else we did that was, I did like Trampled Rose from Tom Waits, because I always loved that number. I thought that was a really cool folk ballad. And I also like that it referenced Kiss is Sweeter Than Wine in the lyric, you know, because
That's funny.
It's just so neat with that. And yeah, so that was like, I think those are the main 3 or 4 we did that weren't stage show, but everything else was Cornbread and Butterbeans, Genuine Negro Jig, Your Baby Ain't Sweet Like Mine, and Peace Behind the Bridge, which was an Etta Baker number that we'd gotten from Music Maker. All the songs had great stories to them, too. Over time, we had crafted a really nice narrative for every song we had done in concert. So it also reinforced what we were saying on stage, or what musically we were saying on stage, too, because that was a big thing. Again, we were in an era when liner notes were receding.
Yeah.
So the fact that we were pushing liner notes was avant-garde, too, because everybody's like, what? There's additional written materials? Why who reads this, you know? But but at the same time, the criteria I personally had for these albums was scholars were going to read these, record collectors, people who like this music might read it too, and I can't just put this stuff out and not have any information. So I was always trying to make sure that I was reinforcing the historical relevance and not making it the forefront, though, because I also didn't, nobody wants too much education, and everybody's worried about that, but no one ever said that the Carolina Chocolate Drops was too educational to listen to on an album. You know what I mean?
Right.
So it was,
no, exactly. Yeah.
So there was always this sort of like give and take that had to happen, where I was always more scholarly than the other two in a general sense in terms of wanting to tell people.
Yeah.
Justin was a linguist, and also he was a specialist in North Carolina horticulture, horticulture as well as fiddle tunes. So that was his interest. So, and then also he had horses and a stable, and he used to love hunting with his coon dogs too. So he was very much a nature guy. So touring for him really was a drag after a while, because he just couldn't justify not being at home. Rhiannon was a different story, because she had previous musical training as an opera singer, and she also had experience doing websites, which is one of the ways that we were able to make a website very early on. Was she made a basic website for us to start out, and then also she had spent time with Sheila K. Adams and people learning ballads. So at first, when I was A&Ring these shows, it'd be like, all right, well, we got 6, kind of like I treated like the New Lost City Ramblers talked about their shows. Okay, we got 6 all together. You do one, and I'll do one. And if we get 2 individually, that's great. And that was most of the show. That would probably be 50 minutes to an hour's worth of show just to do that. So after a while, when it came to the goals, in some ways, again, I'd never want to compare us to the Beatles in terms of like commercial viability. But in terms of like the Beatles, it was the same thing where eventually the three and then eventually the four of us started to drift apart. We had different goals and different things in mind, and we found that there wasn't enough time for us to do the collective.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was kind of the main thing. And also for me, I wanted to get fife and drum music in there. I wanted to get Black Cowboys out finally, and all these projects that I ended up doing solo. I had these songs and this material in my mind, and I'd wanted to arrange them. But every time I brought them up for the group, it just didn't seem like it fit the format right. And so I just held on to them like anything else. And once the group started to recede, I didn't feel a need to have to hold on to it or anything like that. Because to me, Carolina Chocolate Drops is just a name that I made up with some folks in a room. So in my mind, I only hold it so high up.
Yeah.
But in creating the group, I wanted it to be a placeholder. I needed it to be a placeholder because there was no room for an expansive African American Americana idea, at least in the scene at that time. Not in a way that wouldn't be treated as an exception every time. You know what I mean? And I wanted it to be part of the rule, so that when, if you only have one, because again, it's like one black thing a year on the season. It's not a problem in and of itself because you're thinking about it.
Right.
But if a black gospel group comes in, jazz and blues and everybody else has to fight for the single spot. So it just really got me thinking of how could I create a scholarship and a curriculum that would allow for as Roddy Moore put it, non-blues secular black music to be able to fit as its own category for whatever that means.
Yeah.
But I was never trying to bunk the system though, because I thought the system also made sense. It just needed to be improved and added upon. And that's something, too, that's coming up a lot in discussions recently, is people saying, well, let's just take the whole system out and put a new one in. And my approach was always, there's a system that's in place. We can improve it by just putting the facts and the information that's already there, because a lot of my work has just been taking blues and jazz school and putting it into folk school, because there are names and people and places that, now that Americana is sort of like an all-open umbrella term for any type of roots music, the scholarship has to reflect that in some way. Yeah.
So your next thing was the American Songster.
Yeah. Well.
And so talk about songsters. I mean, that's a whole other thing, but it's part of the same tradition as the string bands. Yeah.
Well, the songster started when first time I started to be aware of the term songster was through Paul Oliver's book Songsters and Saints from the mid-'80s. And so that was the first time I became aware that there was a type of musician that played multiple styles of music. And that was really cool to me because, of course, when I first started out, I wanted to be a folk singer. But folk singer was so limiting to what I was actually playing. Because I played some Beatles songs and some Bob Dylan songs, and Bob Dylan can make for folk music, but Beatles is sort of one of the questionable artists on, is that folk or is it not folk?
Right.
But in the 21st century, if everybody knows a song on the ground level, it's technically folk music, but it's not folk music. So it automatically, I found calling myself a folk singer was problematic. I also have never been a bluesy enough player to where I just am not a blues man, like in the conventional setting. So I was always looking for places where I could show off my talents, where I wouldn't be scrutinized for not being one or the other of something. Again, musicians deal with this all the time, and a lot of times what they do is they just focus and go into a single genre.
They become that one thing.
Yeah, they become that one thing. But when I started to do forensics with a lot of the 78s and the 20s stuff, I started to hear songs like Runnin' Wild or Going Down the Dirt Road by Charlie Patton, which are not blues songs. And when I started to hear them, I started to notice there was a slightly different repertoire that was within Charlie Patton's music. Or when I got into Papa Charlie Jackson's music, I found he barely did blues. A lot of it was like these sort of ragtime bluesy songs or ragtime somewhat jazzy songs.
Sure.
And so after I started to find quite a few players from Furry Lewis to Pegleg Howell and whatnot, I started to find that the term songster had some sort of cachet to it. And as I was traveling, I started to try to figure out, because one of the things that really made the Carolina Chocolate Drops so powerful was that Carolina Chocolate Drops was a term that was really easy to say. And I kept searching for something that would define what I did, but it would be easy to say. And it wouldn't be something that someone had used before. So first there were the songsters, and I was drawn to that. And over time, as the digital age came in, I found that songster worked perfectly to describe what most musicians are. Because
Yeah.
most musicians play a little bit of everything. And what I loved about songsters compared to musicianers or music physicianers is that you sang and played. And that was a thing too, as I always sang and played everything. And I do a couple of instrumentals, but I mostly sing and play. So I thought that that fit exactly what I did. And that a songster had a variety of music that fulfilled an audience. And by the time I came up with the term, I was playing for a worldwide audience. So it left the audience quite open-ended. And so I started to think to myself, I wanted to call myself the American songster, because the American songster is just broad enough to where it's a pro-American idea. But I didn't necessarily want to make it sound like a nationalist idea. It's more of just a general the American songster. So because I always have the problem of just only being known as the African American songster.
Right.
Because if I play a Roy Acuff tune, which I did on Black Cowboys, is that African American or is that not African American? See, and it automatically is problematic. But in the context of an American songster, it can work because I'm a musician. There's a beautiful song. I'm performing that song, and that's kind of where I started out with that term. And
Yeah.
my second Music Maker album, I named it American Songster back in 2009. But then over time, I just found that it made a great moniker. So I then now have just it's actually trademarked and incorporated now.
Okay, cool. Well, I mean, one of the things that's cool about it is that if you think about the American songster as a figure besides you, I mean,
Yeah.
as a historical figure, it does typically mean an African American. So it's a place where the African American is the default for America, which is just an interesting fact about it, and a great appropriation by you. I love that. That's great.
Well, it was something that really fit along with what people do in the 21st century. They think about multiple terms. And again, I always am shying away from saying African American all the time, but you bring up exactly the right point, Stephen, is that songsters generally were African American when it evolved past being a songster song lyric book.
Right.
Most of the African American songsters being from oral tradition, they just knew a variety of songs because they had a kind of a free-flowing audience that would ask for popular songs as well as folk material. And yeah, and that was something that I just found that the scholarship would back up the American songster, but
Yeah.
it would allow me to be able to play rock and roll and folk at the same time, where I wouldn't have to justify it. And again, I think most musicians, I would hope that any musician would want to call themselves a songster after a point too.
Yeah.
Because it's a ubiquitous term that can be used for anything from the pop singers to the most basic folky of folk people too. So it's kind of a fun thing too.
Sounds good. Well, so your latest American Songster project was the Black Cowboy album.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that a little. What spurred you to do that?
Well-
Spurred. I used the cowboy word there. I didn't even think about it.
Well, I got on the trail with this one, Stephen, but I got on the trail with Black Cowboys by I was actually visiting my family. That was how it started, being from Phoenix, Arizona, born and raised, and being both African American and Mexican American by descent. It was something that was always a part of my story. I know the story of African American and Mexican American people in the Southwest just by the nature of living and growing up with it. But the story of cowboys was always somewhat removed because, of course, I grew up in the city. And I was visiting family, I guess around the holidays for Christmas. I try to go back to Phoenix whenever I can. And I was over by the Painted Desert on the New Mexican border. And just from a distance, I saw in the gift shop this book called The Negro Cowboys, and I just was drawn to it, and I went to it, and I was like, wow, okay, and it had a picture of Nat Love on the front of it.
Sure.
And especially within that particular portrait when he has the big Mexican vaqueros hat, it's very striking. So I saw the book from across the way, and as I started to read it, it just completely turned me on to this whole idea of how African American Western culture was sorely underrepresented in a full historical context. Not so much that people weren't aware of it, because I knew that most African American people had some sort of connection to Black Western culture, whether it was my folks came from Kansas, or my folks came from the Deep South, went west, or even up to the modern day, my folks came from the East and they went out west. And there's plenty of African American people who have migrated out west for one reason or another since the beginning of time, we can find out. And that was actually the hardest thing for me as I began to delve into it. Was I first read this awesome, beautiful history that goes back to well, my brother's name is Esteban Estefanico Dickey Flemons, and so it goes back to Estefanico, the very first African, which also allowed me to talk to my dad. I said, "Did you know it was that deep with Estefanico?" He said, "Yes, I did." And I said, "Okay, fine." So this all goes back in some ways to my father's education, subconscious education of my brother and myself, and at least in African American history. So as I started to delve into the Black Cowboys, I found this very elaborate story, and I just thought to myself this would make a beautiful album in general. And then the second thing I came across was the album Black Texicans from the Deep River Song Collection. So that was my second jumping off point. So it actually gave me a musical reference point, specifically when I heard that Old Chisholm Trail from Clear Rock Platte. When you hear that version of the Old Chisholm Trail, you can understand why Black cowboy music is distinctive from white cowboy music, or at least the Anglo ballad tradition that John Lomax pushed in all of his scholarship. You at least get to hear audio-wise that there's a difference. And of course the other part of it is that John Lomax recorded this too, so it also tells you that John Lomax is at least hip to the idea of African American informants before he goes fully into Negro folk songs. And so for me, again, as a scholar, that was also interesting to think of Black Cowboys as being a conduit for John Lomax to reach into Negro folk songs, which his career as a scholar eventually evolved in that way. So it was kind of a revelation to think of the cowboy story as having African American cowboys. But of course it was problematic because, you know, well then what is the Black cowboy music compared to other types of cowboy music? And then if I made a Black Cowboys album, how general should I be about general cowboy history? And then what cowboy songs, classic cowboy songs, are Black cowboy songs? Or which ones would benefit from a Black cowboy's treatment? For example, like Little Joe the Wrangler. That song's not about black or white or Mexican or Native American cowboys, but it's the song of a young boy who leaves his home because his stepmother beats him, becomes a part of a cowboy band, tries to be a hero and dies doing it. Now, if you make that an African American boy, that takes a whole other emotional experience. Same thing with the Mexican vaquero boy or a Native American boy, compared to him just being white, which again, it's always been just assumed he was white because we think of John Wayne, we think of any number of popular Hollywood cowboys that are white. And now to find that there's a lot of history that shows that there's a generation or there's a prehistory that shows Black cowboys, that's where it started to really get interesting to me, because at first I ran across all the scholarship that said it was literally whitewashing that led it to go away. But as I started to read more about some of the history, like particularly Nat Love's autobiography, I found that African American history was still going the whole time in spite of this whitewashing. And a lot of times, specifically Nat Love was very telling, where you have a man that's born into slavery, he gets emancipated, then becomes a cowboy, then he works on the railroad line and becomes a Pullman porter, and then in the end of his life he's wanting to make a retirement center for old Pullman porters. So it's kind of like a very interesting story of a man that knows a horse and buggy as well as an airplane or automobile or a car. And so for me, that it started to get me thinking back to my father's father, my grandfather, who had come out from East Texas and then was in Flagstaff, and he was a sawmill worker and a preacher. And then my dad moved down to Flagstaff to get away from the country, but to know that my grandfather had a similar westward journey, it started to like really open up my family story in my mind in a different type of way than I had previously thought about it. It's hard to put the folkloric hat on your own family just because they're your family and it's just a given in some ways. And so that was my journey. So I ended up approaching Black Cowboys in four ways, because of course Dan Sheehy was all over the project when I presented the project to Smithsonian Folkways, as well as Dwandalyn Reese, because I had had played a gig with the Chocolate Drops at the Museum of the American Indian years ago. And Dwandalin was over at a little bench advertising for the opening of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And they had stuff of Satchel Paige and stuff, I think, that year. But I started to talk with her a little bit about it, and I kept it in my mind that that museum was opening up.
Yeah.
So when I knew the museum was starting to open up, I had this Black Cowboys project in front of me, and I said, I'm going to try it. I'm going to try to get in the African American Legacy series, because there hadn't been a lot of contemporary artists on the series at that point. And so I also wanted to make it a contemporary artist series, and then Black Cowboys. I knew that, one, the Smithsonian was the only place that would understand a cowboy project, because they usually are the only ones that do.
Right.
Cowboy music is neither cowboy nor folk music, it's neither country music nor folk music all the way, so it's kind of both. So once I started to get the green light that it was going to be part of the Legacy series, that's when the liner notes took a whole other level. Because at first I was going to write everything. And then I realized that that wasn't going to be as effective as writing a few numbers and then giving a comprehensive history, knowing that this museum was going to be one of the foundational places that most African Americans could go. I thought to myself, let me get this. I could visualize. I had Black Cowboys in the gift shop of the African American Museum. But then I was like, not only that, in the gift shop of every Western museum, because I travel to a lot of museums, and I found that there was only one African American representation in every museum. It was either just Buffalo Soldiers or just Cowboys or just one thing or another. So a comprehensive overview I knew would be a righteous deed in itself. So it was kind of like a weird move in terms of being a viable commercial artist, because it was a very different album, but it was so righteous as a subject and as an idea. I had to push all the way through it, and of course I had my wife Vania to help me edit, this 800 years of history. Like from this 1619 is just the beginning with Black Cowboys.
Right.
Then it just goes back. It just keeps going back.
Yeah. But I think it's interesting that both in the sort of string band and old time area, and also in the cowboy side of things, there is, of course, systemic racism, as there is everywhere.
That's right. But
there's also good people who have a hunger for knowing about the African American side of things.
Absolutely.
Do you know what I mean? And you've successfully found those people and made products for them to enjoy, and also made a niche for yourself in terms of traveling to those places.
Absolutely. Well, I wanted to bring a little bit of all of the experiences I had gotten to that point with the Black Cowboys, because of course there was the who and the when and the where were all easy, but the why was the hardest part. That's when the Pullman Porter story began to take interest to me, was because now the Pullman Porters, because of course in the museum they have that beautiful Southern Railway, that whole car in there. I thought about that, because halfway in finishing up the record, the museum officially opened. So then I was able to see where the Black Cowboys story could go to represent the museum then. And so I ended up using 4 different methods. I first took songs that were associated with Black Cowboys, Home on the Range and Goodbye Old Paint, which of course you were a wonderful help in, because of course, because at the same time Stephen Wade did the wonderful book, The Beautiful Music All Around Us, and that really got me very inspired about Goodbye Old Paint.
Yeah.
Because again, you have a story like where Jess Morris is a white man who's a fiddler, but he grows up with his father owning a ranch, and then through 2 different Black Cowboys, he learns, one, the song Goodbye Old Paint, to sing it from Charlie Willis, who apparently plays it on the jaw harp, and he sings it to him. And then another guy, James Neely, who was a fiddler, who teaches him how to play the fiddle. And over time, Jess Morris makes a fiddle arrangement of this jaw harp song he learned way back. So it automatically is this very interesting story of African American representation in a world famous song. Not just any old song, a world famous one. And then Home on the Range has its own version of it, being one of the early cylinder recordings that John Lomax recorded of this variant on the lyric Home on the Range. And then that, as I've studied it too, to find out that the actual informant was an old-time Buffalo soldier, and that the informant in of itself and the removal of these informants from the Alamo is also an impetus for this whole recording session. It automatically tells a lot of again, a lot of the beautiful history of African American contributions, but it also shows a lot of the negative history. But I didn't want to spend all of my time talking about the negative history, because with Cowboys in particular, there was so much information about whitewashing that I didn't want everybody to get completely caught up in the album, caught up in whitewashing, because that's not how Black Cowboys were. Black Cowboys were innovative because they showed up in town. They were like the best worker or an outstanding citizen in town, and because they might be the only black person in town, they give a great impression of all black people to that community, which is in some ways is the opposite of what people say now. They say, "Oh, I'm uncomfortable because I'm the only one." But in the Black Cowboy setting, they have to be not only comfortable, but they almost have to overcompensate and be an excellent worker, far better than everybody else,
Right.
just to make up for the fact that they're the only one and that scrutiny could be around the corner. But I wanted to focus on the fact that these guys are walking through town and just people are, again, symbolically just moving out the way and then building towns behind the work that these guys are doing, or the African American women, which is why I put a song like Black Woman into the mix, because I found there was a lot of history of African American women building towns in the West as well, which was something I was not familiar with before I started this project. So there was a little bit of that for Black Cowboys, songs associated with them. I wanted to show Southern interchange and cultural development. That's why I had like Going Down the Road Feeling Bad and Knox County Stomp, to kind of show that Southern music tradition sort of translated over, and just gave a flavor of it without getting too bogged down, because of course this is hundreds of years of information, and I knew from the get-go that I'd never be able to cover Black Cowboys 100% in one 60-minute record. So
Right.
I kind of moved it on real quick. So I had those two things. I had songs I wrote, which was $1 Bill, Steel Pony Blues, and He's a Lone Ranger, which I wrote about Nat Love and Bill Pickett and Bass Reeves, because I found they were three dynamic figures that kept coming up again and again. So I also knew that they needed to be represented in new songs, because they just hadn't been. And $1 Bill, I had the great fortune of having Alvin Youngblood Hart and Jimbo Mathis play on that one, and I'd always loved Alvin's slide guitar playing. So just to have that on an album was a great honor. Plus, it just gave this really great flavor of black country music in its own type of way. Again, you have to imagine that if nobody knows what it means, they have no set idea of what black cowboys should sound like. So even when I sequenced it, I had first a black cowboy on the range singing Black Woman. Then it kind of becomes a big sound with Texas Easy Street. So it's Henry Thomas without the quills.
Yeah.
Then it turns into $1 Bill, which it's kind of based off of a song from Horace Sprott, from the Music from the South series that Frederick Ramsey did years back. And I heard his song, he has a song that's kind of like it, but I couldn't understand what the verses were because he sang everything a cappella.
Yeah.
So I made a song off of that, because he's saying, well, it's $1 bill, $2 bill, ain't nothing like that old railroad bill, But he also had the other song that, Mama, He Treats Your Daughter Mean, which I always thought was interesting, because he says, Mama, Don't Treat Your Daughter Mean is his song. And I've always had a theory that the song that Ruth Brown sang later on, Mama, He Treats Your Daughter Mean, they took some sort of variation off of that song.
Yeah.
But, I took a little bit of that old song, because in his interview he said he learned it from a banjo player, so I made it a banjo song. But for once $1 Bill, I wanted Going Down the Road Feeling Bad to be that was, track 4 to 7, up all the way through Old Proc. Those tracks are meant to be a small cowboy show in of itself. So after you get $1 Bill, the cowboys going down the road feeling bad. They go through the paper awning, and then they're off on the road. But I wanted it to be very theatrical as well, because of being from Arizona. One of the most famous cowboy albums is the Gunfighter Ballads and Trail Songs album from Marty Robbins.
Yeah.
And I wanted it to be a folkier album than Marty Robbins, but I wanted it to be something that would be like universally loved like Marty Robbins. And so with those first three ideas, the last thing was just ambient songs. Like Knox County Stomp is kind of an ambient instrumental. March of Red River Valley was another one, because I couldn't get into the Buffalo Soldiers or Native American removal or anything in the course of Black Cowboys. 7,500 wasn't even enough words for what we
Yeah.
got. But something about the Red River Valley as a fife number with the bass drum, it implied it somehow. And I
Right.
wanted
I
to
see what
have
you mean,
I
yeah.
wanted to have several segments that would imply certain movements of Western history. Because of course,
Interesting.
after the Red River Valley, then we go right to Clear Rock Platte with the old Chisholm Trail, which
Yeah.
of course symbolically to me, I want it to be a cappella to start and a cappella to end, to show kind of a movement of song through African American experience, through time and space in some type of way.
Mm-hmm.
But that was sort of the basic idea around Black Cowboys.
All right.
Then we were here over at Tonal Park, and had the great fortune on top of a recording with Jimbo and Alvin in Mississippi. I had Dante Pope and Brian Farrow, who are two DC locals around here, joining me. They played on my trio many times. And then Dan Sheehy, actually, when we were in the middle of recording, he had his guitarón for a benefit that he was going to do later that night, and he joked with me. He said, "Oh yeah, well I'll get the guitarón out if you want." And I said, "Get that guitarón out!"
Are you kidding me?
And
Absolutely.
and it made it, and it was funny because that was the one thing when we were cutting it. Again, even up to all the preparation I was just telling you about, the one thing I was really worried about was that we weren't going to have enough Tex-Mex flavor or Latino flavor anywhere, because at that point I just had John Henry y los Vaqueros, which touches upon
Yeah.
the idea a little bit. But once we added that guitarón, it implied enough Tex-Mex to be able to give us just a wonderful sound that, it worked out well. And of course, everywhere I went, every Western museum was glad to partner with me, or there was, it like the Chocolate Drops in its own way, but much bigger. The Cowboys idea is just such a universal idea of not just American culture, African American, Latino culture, and all these, and Native American culture, and then Western culture as a phenomenon. And then, of course, I had the great honor of seeing 2019 be the big year of Black Cowboys in the wake of the Grammy nomination,
Yeah.
which is something I had only hoped in 10, 20 years you might see a hip-hop artist say Black Cowboys. You might see them
Right.
say it. But to see that so many all at one time, boom, 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 and then there was the Yeehaw agenda, the big social media movement. All of these things were things I had hoped could be justified or rectified through this album. And it was so great that, again, I was, if I had released the album 1 year later, everybody might have just treated it like everybody was just having a big novelty time of putting a cowboy hat
Yeah.
on. Because the West is, of course, two things. There's the physical, literal West, but then there's the West of the imagination, and
Yeah.
they both ebb and flow so.
The Mythic West.
Yeah, they ebb and flow so much in American culture now that it's so hard to differentiate the two. And again, Black Cowboys was constantly, I had to, nope, that's too,
Yeah.
too much, But anyway,
Yeah. Well, I think we probably have only time for one more question, which I only want to get in there because of who I am and who we are, in the sense that I first met you in 2007. I've got a photo because I'm the photographer for my office at work, among other things, and took pictures of you and Justin in the reading room at the Library of Congress with the big drawer from the card catalog. And so most of our interaction has been around archival work, and you're digging stuff out of the archives for your musical projects. So if you would say a little about the importance of archives and the preservation of field work in audiovisual archives.
Oh, absolutely. Well, the importance of any type of archive is that the documentation is in place for future generations to be able to access. That's ultimately where we want to be with documentation all the time. It's not always clear that you can go into the library and find that documentation a lot easier than you would suspect. And I was surprised when I first went to the Library of Congress how easy it was for me to find some of the original recordings of, particularly of Alan and John Lomax, which I was interested in. And then, of course, I found out about Herbert Halpert, and I found out that it wasn't just one folklorist that did everything for the archive, but it was multiple folklore. So that in of itself was an education. And the fact that you can hear what the original archivist or documentarian heard through their headphones when they made their
Yeah.
field recordings and hear it in the same way they did,
Yeah.
even when they got their playback. I mean, that's so exciting and exhilarating. In its own type of way, it's like when you've been listening to an album on CD forever and you put it on an LP, you put the LP version on, and a nice clean LP, you find that you're transported in a different way. It's no longer zeros and ones, but it's actual physical material. And it's even more so in the archives, where it's actual physical material. Or even, for me, I just love being able to replicate your announcer on there with the, tape 6785 side B.
Yeah.
And those are the sort of things that you hear them so many years when you're away from the archive, but when you finally get to go into the library. And what's funny is in the Lomax archives, I got to hear that fellow say, "This is Library of Congress Archive Tape 1." And he's really enthusiastic, Tape 1! But by the time he's like, "Archive tape 267589 side B." Like you could tell he read every single number up to that point. But
Right.
that alone, that's not something that's apparent when you're listening to archives. Also, another thing, in the digital age, we're in such a monumental era of documentation. People don't realize that it takes more than just putting a microphone in front of someone to get a full oral history, documentation, and sometimes musical materials if, for example, a musician may not be familiar with performing in public. There's a whole series of techniques that you can use to help accentuate and to raise up a artist, as well as create the most optimal documentation in a formal setting. And that in of itself was another bit of education outside of me as a layman being interested in records and discographies. Then I found there was a method to being a librarian, which was important for me to make my Southern Folklife collection over at UNC Chapel Hill. Because of course my house is not full of a bunch of memorabilia anymore, because thankfully I learned I could put my archives into a collection, into a museum or a library, and that would be something people could have for future generations.
It's good for you, and it's
good for everybody.
Everybody, exactly.
Yeah, it's when they say that when Alexander the Great's library burned down, it was a great tragedy of the world's culture. I mean, that's the sort of thing that still happens to this day. Like even in the digital age, I've seen people say, "Oh, well, we don't need libraries like we used to." Trust me, when you take libraries out, you're going to find out that you needed those libraries all the time. And it's a luxury that we have them to access. And even when I was learning, if I ever need to learn more about any musician, I could always go to the library and find additional documentation. And I think that's so important to everyone. But of course, when I went to the Library of Congress, that's the top of the heap, man. I was able to.
We like to think so.
And even the Library of Congress recordings that have been commercially released are probably less than 1% of what you all have in the actual archives.
Yeah.
Like, I remember we had an interesting conversation about Bones, and you started to bring me a bunch of recordings of Bones players of over time. There was even a cowboy band that had a Bones player, I even remember. And just to hear new worlds that I had never heard before. Again, commercially you would think you've heard everything that's ever been recorded, but you find out that that's never been the truth. I guess I can tie it in a bow with one thing Tosh told me. He once told me, he said, you can keep digging into this music for the next 100 years, and you'll find that you've never even broken the surface. And I found that that's true every time.
All right, well, on that note, I think we shall end the interview. So thank you so much, Dom Flemons, for this fantastic oral history interview about your career and your life as the American songster.
Well, thank you, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be with you as always.